When I tell people my older sister made my entire teenage years a living hell, they usually think I'm talking about typical sibling rivalry, a few stolen clothes, or a mean comment here and there. But the truth is much darker. My name is Leona, I'm 31, and for the first time in my life, I'm finally breathing the crisp Seattle air without looking over my shoulder. It's taken me 15 years to escape the shadow of a woman who built her entire identity on stepping over my broken dreams to reach the top. Growing up, she wasn't just the golden child. She was a master manipulator who could burn your house down and then convince our parents you were the one holding the matches. At a recent family gathering in our Seattle estate, she smirked at me over her wine glass and announced to the room, "Poor Leona got fired from her high-paying job last week for her attitude problem." Every head turned toward me, eyes filled with that familiar, stinging pity. I didn't flinch. I just took a sip of my drink, looked her dead in the eye, and said, "Actually, I was fired because I exposed my boss for massive embezzlement, the same boss you've been funneling family money to for 3 years." The silence that followed was heavy, enough to make the city's constant rain feel like a roar, but that was just the beginning of how I finally dismantled her house of cards. If you love stories about justice served cold and toxic family secrets being brought to light, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a single twist in this journey of redemption. Long before that explosive dinner in our Seattle home, the cracks in our foundation had already turned into canyons. It started during my junior year at Roosevelt High, a time when I was buried in textbooks, obsessing over a full-ride scholarship to the University of Washington. Cassandra, 3 years my senior, was already living a life of curated perfection, drifting through community college on our father's dime while resenting every ounce of my academic success. I remember the exact Tuesday afternoon my world collapsed under the weight of her envy. I was called into Principal Moss's office, feeling a strange, suffocating tightness in my chest as I saw my worn backpack sitting on his mahogany desk, unzipped for the entire faculty to see. Inside, hidden behind my calculus notes and handwritten essays, were 3 pristine copies of the upcoming state chemistry final, the very exam that determined my entire academic future. I stared at them, my voice catching in my throat as I tried to explain that I had never seen those papers before in my life. But the evidence was damning, and the anonymous tip that had led the administration to my locker was described by the principal as ironclad and indisputable. When our parents, Gerald and Martha, arrived at the school, there was no room for a defense or even a moment of doubt. Cassandra was already there, standing by the office door with a look of practiced heartbreak, her hand resting comfortingly on my mother's shoulder as if she were the one suffering. She didn't say a single word to me, but the way she whispered to Dad about the immense pressure of being perfect was a masterclass in psychological sabotage. Gerald, a man who valued the family's reputation in our affluent Seattle neighborhood above all else, didn't even bother to look at my perfect attendance record or my clean history. He saw a thief and a daughter who had publicly embarrassed his legacy. Despite my desperate pleas and tears, I was suspended indefinitely, and the scholarship I had bled for vanished overnight, like mist over Puget Sound. Cassandra's reign of terror didn't stop at the school gates. She brought it back into our living room, painting me as a fragile, dishonest girl who needed tough love to be corrected. I was 16, isolated in a house that felt more like a prison, watching Cassandra receive praise for her honesty while I was forced to take a grueling part-time job at a local diner just to save enough for a cheap community college tuition. That was the year I realized that in the Harrison family, the truth was whatever Cassandra decided it would be, and I was just an obstacle she intended to crush. By the time I reached my mid-20s, the silence between me and the rest of the Harrison family had become a permanent, agonizing fixture in our lives. While I worked double shifts at a local credit union in downtown Seattle to pay for my final semester of finance school, Cassandra was busy reinventing herself as a high-end real estate consultant. She moved back into our parents' estate, claiming she wanted to be closer to Gerald and Martha as they aged, but I knew her presence always came with a hidden price tag. She had traded her high school popularity for a calculated corporate persona that mirrored the foggy, deceptive mornings of the Pacific Northwest. Every time I visited for a mandatory Sunday dinner, I saw new, expensive renovations in the house, imported Italian marble and designer furniture that seemed at odds with my father's modest retirement income. I started noticing the red flags during a rare weekend when Gerald, still healthy but increasingly forgetful, asked me to help him organize some old tax documents in his study. My father, once a sharp man who managed his own construction supply business, seemed confused by the recent statements from his 401k and pension funds. When I glanced at the ledgers, my heart sank. There were multiple large withdrawals labeled as private equity investments authorized by Cassandra. She had convinced our parents that the market was crashing and that their only hope for a secure future was to move their life savings into a guaranteed real estate fund she managed. In reality, she was using their hard-earned money to fund her own lavish lifestyle, buying designer handbags and hosting parties to maintain her status among Seattle's elite, while Gerald and Martha cheered for her business success. Whenever I tried to bring up the inconsistencies in the accounts to my parents, Martha would immediately shut me down, her voice trembling with a mix of loyalty and misplaced pride. Cassandra had spent years poisoning their minds, telling them that my career in finance was just a way for me to spy on their wealth out of bitterness for my lost scholarship. She played the role of the devoted daughter so convincingly that any question I asked was treated as an act of betrayal against the family. While I was climbing the corporate ladder through grit and late nights, Cassandra was building a house of cards on the foundation of our parents' trust. I realized then that she wasn't just a bully anymore, she was a predator, and she was systematically draining the life savings out of the two people who still believed she was their greatest achievement. The rain was relentless the morning I walked into the glass-walled offices of Henderson Risk Management, a premier financial firm in the heart of downtown Seattle. For 3 years, I had meticulously built my reputation as a senior analyst, but the atmosphere had recently shifted into something cold and suspicious. It started when my manager, Mr. Henderson, began assigning me to high-stakes accounts that felt fundamentally flawed, filled with shell companies and circular transactions. During a routine internal audit, my heart stopped when I pulled up a digital loan application for a multi-million-dollar property in Bellevue. My electronic signature was at the bottom, certifying a series of fraudulent assets that I had never even reviewed. As I dug deeper, the paper trail led straight to a boutique real estate firm owned by Cassandra. My sister hadn't just been stealing from our parents. She was using my professional credentials to launder the very money she had stripped from their retirement accounts. She and Mr. Henderson were old friends from their college days, a connection she had hidden from me while encouraging me to take the job years ago. They had been using my clean record as a shield for their illegal schemes, knowing that if the authorities ever looked into the filings, I would be the one facing a prison sentence. When I confronted Mr. Henderson in his private office, showing him the forged documents and the links to Cassandra's accounts, he didn't even blink. He leaned back in his leather chair, a smug smile playing on his lips, and told me that I was clearly overwhelmed and hallucinating conspiracies that didn't exist. 2 hours later, security escorted me out of the building. Cassandra had anticipated my move and had already whispered into Mr. Henderson's ear, crafting a narrative that I was mentally unstable and had attempted to blackmail the firm after a performance review. I stood on the sidewalk, my box of personal belongings getting soaked in the Seattle mist, but I wasn't defeated. I had managed to secure an encrypted flash drive containing every forged signature and every suspicious transfer linked to Cassandra's business. I knew that by accepting the dismissal for an alleged attitude problem, I was giving her the false sense of security she needed to keep digging her own grave. She thought she had silenced me by ruining my career, but she had actually handed me the keys to her downfall. I spent the next few days in a quiet corner of the Seattle Public Library, connecting the dots between her glamorous lifestyle and the systematic destruction of our family's future. A chilling October wind swept through the Harborview Medical Center in Seattle, echoing the cold reality that had finally shattered our family's illusions. 2 weeks after I was escorted out of my office, I received a frantic, sobbing voicemail from my mother, Martha, that sent me racing to their estate. When I arrived, the sight was haunting. A bright orange foreclosure notice was taped to the mahogany front door of the home I had grown up in. Gerald had collapsed in the foyer after receiving a letter from the bank, clutching legal documents that revealed every cent of their retirement savings, their home equity, and even their life insurance policies had been drained. Cassandra's guaranteed investments had been nothing more than a personal slush fund to pay off her mounting debts and maintain her facade of success among the city's elite. My father's stroke left him unable to speak, his eyes filled with a hollow, haunting betrayal as he lay in the sterile white light of the intensive care unit. Martha sat by his side, her hands trembling as she realized the daughter she had championed for decades had effectively rendered them homeless. But the true horror wasn't the loss of the money, it was Cassandra's reaction when she finally showed up at the hospital. She didn't come with flowers or tears of regret. She walked into the room wearing a $1,000 trench coat, her eyes scanning the bedside table, not for medical updates, but for my father's personal effects. While I was whispering words of comfort to Dad, Cassandra pulled me into the hallway, her voice a sharp, hushed blade. She didn't ask how he was doing. Instead, she demanded to know where the backup keys to his private safe were kept. She claimed she needed immediate authorization to manage the remaining family assets to save the house, but I saw through the lie instantly. She was looking for the physical titles to a small plot of commercial land my father owned in West Seattle, the only thing she hadn't managed to steal yet. When I refused to give her any information, her mask of the grieving daughter slipped, revealing a predatory coldness that made my blood run cold. She hissed that I was being selfish and obstructive during a family crisis, even as our father fought for his life just inches away. I watched her walk away, her heels clicking rhythmically against the hospital floor, and realized that she was no longer just a sibling I disliked. She was a threat that needed to be neutralized before she could cause any more destruction. The gray mist of Seattle seemed to swallow the cemetery whole on the afternoon we buried Gerald and Martha, just 3 weeks after the hospital confrontation. For Cassandra, the funeral was nothing more than a stage for her final, chilling performance. Within 48 hours of the burial, she had already installed a high-tech security system at the family estate, effectively locking me out of the only home I had ever known. While I was still grieving in a cramped motel room near Lake Union, Cassandra was busy distributing a polished, 3-page statement of facts to our extended family and former business associates. She had hired a boutique PR firm to craft a narrative that painted me as a vengeful, unstable daughter who had caused our father's stroke by demanding money during his final days. The social isolation was surgical and swift. My phone, once filled with messages from cousins and family friends, became a void of blocked numbers and unreturned calls. Every time I tried to reach out to explain the foreclosure notices or the missing 401k funds, I was met with icy silence or accusations of disrespecting the dead. Cassandra had even managed to produce a notarized amendment to my father's will, a document that conveniently surfaced just days after the funeral. It stated that due to my unethical conduct at my previous job and my hostility toward the family, my entire inheritance was to be placed in a trust managed solely by her. She stood on the front porch of the mansion, flanked by 2 expensive lawyers, as she watched me try to retrieve a small box of my mother's old photographs. She didn't just want the money, she wanted to erase my existence from the Harrison legacy. She told the local newspapers that I was a cautionary tale of greed, using her influence in the Seattle real estate scene to ensure no reputable firm would ever hire me again. I watched from the sidewalk as she hosted a remembrance brunch for the very people she was currently defrauding, her laughter echoing through the open windows like a jagged piece of glass. She felt invincible, surrounded by the shields of legal jargon and public sympathy she had so carefully constructed. But as I sat in my car, watching the elite of Seattle offer her their condolences, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Cassandra's arrogance was her greatest weakness. She assumed that because she had silenced the family, she had silenced the truth. What she didn't know was that while she was busy posing for photos and playing the grieving heiress, I was already in contact with a man who knew the secrets she thought were buried with our parents. The neon lights of a diner in Seattle's Rainier Valley flickered as I waited for the one man Cassandra hadn't been able to buy. Lawyer Vance, a silver-haired veteran of the Washington State Bar, slid into the booth across from me, his expression unreadable as he placed a battered leather briefcase on the table. For months, Cassandra had been using a high-profile firm in Bellevue to push her forged documents, but she had overlooked the fact that my father, Gerald, was a man of old-school habits. He hadn't trusted her for a long time. Vance opened the briefcase to reveal a series of notarized files that had been kept in a private safety deposit box, far away from the reach of my sister's hired PR team. The first document was the authentic, final version of my father's will, dated just weeks before his stroke. In his own handwriting, he had left the West Seattle commercial land and the remaining family trusts solely to me, citing his deep-seated concerns over Cassandra's reckless financial behavior. But it was the second folder that made my blood run cold. Vance had spent weeks quietly subpoenaing my mother's medical records from a private clinic in Capitol Hill. The lab results showed elevated levels of heavy sedatives in Martha's system during the months leading up to her death medications she had never been prescribed by her primary physician. Cassandra hadn't just been stealing their money, she had been systematically drugging our mother to keep her compliant while she forced her to sign over the $401k withdrawals. I stared at the grainy photos of the forged signatures next to the genuine ones, the evidence of my sister's cruelty laid bare in black and white. Vance looked me in the eye and told me that he had already been in contact with the King County Prosecutor's Office. My sister's arrogance had led her to believe that she could bury the truth under a mountain of fake smiles and social media posts, but she had left a digital and medical trail that was now impossible to erase. As the rain drummed against the diner's windows, I realized that the attitude problem she had mocked at the dinner table was exactly what was going to put her behind bars. I wasn't just a bitter sister anymore. I was the primary witness in a criminal investigation that would dismantle her life piece by piece. The grand mahogany doors of the Harrison estate opened one last time for a gathering that Cassandra had intended to be her final coronation. She sat at the head of the long dining table, draped in expensive black silk, her eyes gleaming with the triumph of a woman who believed she had successfully buried her sins. But the atmosphere shifted when Lawyer Vance entered, followed not by more sycophants, but by two detectives from the Seattle Police Department. Cassandra's smirk faltered as Vance calmly presented the authentic will and the medical reports detailing the unauthorized sedation of our mother. The room fell into a deafening silence as the lead officer stepped forward, reciting her rights while clicking a pair of cold steel handcuffs around her manicured wrists. She didn't go quietly. She shrieked about her status and her contributions to the city, but the evidence of elder abuse and grand larceny was an anchor that pulled her straight to the bottom of the Puget Sound she so loved to overlook. I watched from the doorway, feeling no surge of pity as they led her out into the relentless Seattle rain to a waiting patrol car. Within a month, I liquidated every asset associated with the estate, ensuring the West Seattle land was preserved as a public park in my father's name, a place of peace, not greed. I settled the debts Cassandra had incurred, gave a generous severance to my father's loyal staff, and signed the final papers to sell the mansion. I didn't leave a forwarding address or a phone number for the relatives who had once turned their backs on me. As I drove across the Evergreen Point floating bridge, leaving the skyline of Seattle in my rearview mirror, I realized that some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. They are meant to be burned, so you can never go back to the person you used to be. I was free, and for the first time, the silence was finally peaceful.